This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. With just 3 months left before the midterm elections, the outlook for Democrats depends on how the white working class votes, says public opinion expert Ruy Teixeira. Economic analyst Mike Konczal says Democrats have to defend the social safety net because the evidence says voluntary help to the poor never works. And Bill Press talks with retiring Senator Tom Harkin, the founder of 21st Century Democrats. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Noted Democratic political analyst Ruy Teixeira says Democrats have an uphill battle in the 2014 elections, and maybe in 2016, unless the white working class can be turned around. And we say hello to Ruy Teixeira, who's a senior fellow at both the Century Foundation and the Center for American Progress. He is co-author with John Halpin of an article in Washington Monthly on how to shape an economic message that appeals to the white working class. Ruy Teixeira, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you as well. Your article talks about the need for Democrats to regain the votes of the white working class. How bad is the situation now in terms of voting percentages by race and income?
Well, if you look at the data from the 2012 election, an election in which the Democrats overall did pretty well, Obama won a pretty easy re-election contest. He nevertheless lost the white working class, white non-college voters, by 26 points, which was quite a bit worse than he did in 2008, worse than John Kerry did in 2004, and worse than Al Gore did in 2000. So the trend line is not good, despite the fact that the Democrats have been benefiting from a whole series of interlinked demographic changes, which have changed the structure of the electorate in a way that benefits the Democrats. They've been losing ground among this still pretty large, albeit declining as a share of voters, demographic. They just don't seem to be playing well among these voters.
Now, your thesis is that Democrats don't have to or even can win back a majority of the white working class, but they can cut into the Republican share of their vote. So how do Democrats do that?
Well, I think if you look at the things that white non-college voters care about, at the top of the list is essentially economic-related and economic insecurity-related issues and a feeling that the economy at this point works much more and maybe even primarily and sometimes even exclusively for the top 1% and doesn't really work well for anybody else. And that's not fair, and that they believe that interferes with their own ability to get ahead. So they buy that analysis. They see the middle class is losing ground and feel that the middle class is, in the end, the key to economic growth and prosperity in the country, and they're getting the shaft. And they believe all those things. Mm-hmm. So that is probably the way into their heads. Now, one has to realize that even though that therefore means that there are certain issues that aren't going to be great sells with these voters, like same-sex marriage, like immigration, like several other things that are pretty good for base groups of the Democratic Party. But that's not how you're going to get these voters. Now, the good news is they're much less hostile to these issues and much less sensitive to them than they used to be. I mean, you can talk about same-sex marriage, and it's probably not going to hurt you that much with the white working class, but what it won't do is convert any of them. Mm-hmm. Convert any of them to believe that Democrats, in fact, know how to get the government on their side and, for their economic welfare instead of someone else. Because that's why they're so suspicious of government and so cynical about it, is fundamentally they believe that the government, in the end, serves the interests of the wealthy much more than the middle class, and, therefore, what good is it?
Well, and I think that you can look back at a trend in that regard, trickle-down economics, starting with Ronald Reagan, right? Now we can't we keep saying we are out of this recession, but there are a great number of people that would make an argument that, hey, I'm not out of the recession. I'm still hurt and I still can't find a job and that kind of thing. So the pushback that we've gotten from Republicans on a lot of things in terms of trying to create jobs, I mean, how much of an issue is that, and how much can you make that the issue moving forward? Just to put pressure, in fact, just to so that the Republicans will work together with the Democrats and vice versa.
Right. Well, that is the problem, that the things that you could do that might actually get the economy growing faster than it is, besides just sort of waiting around for the business cycle to pick up, the proactive things you could do to help create jobs and produce faster economic growth, they generally tend to involve spending money. And spending money is exactly the thing that the Republicans are adamantly opposed to, unless, say, it's on, missiles or something. So that's made it pretty difficult for the Democrats to make any progress on that front since the stimulus plan. They floated the American Jobs Act, as you remember, in late 2011, and that was very popular with the public, but of course it gets nowhere in Congress. And the fact that it doesn't get through Congress because Republicans are adamantly opposed to doing anything about this in any way doesn't necessarily mean, in fact, it doesn't mean that the incumbent party still doesn't get the blame for the lame economy and for its failure to grow faster and for the continuing relatively high levels of unemployment. The incumbent party always, in the end, gets most of the blame for that, and that's really the great weakness for the Democrats at this point, and potentially for the 2016 run, but more immediately in the 2014 election. It's difficult to get people as enthusiastic as you might be able to get them if the economy was doing better, and it's easier for the other side to mobilize their voters when they feel like this administration is not only taking away our freedom, but they can't even run the economy properly. And that's where a lot of these white working class voters come in, because they listen to those kinds of analyses and ideas, and so it's kind of like, what have you done for me lately? And if they don't feel you've done a lot for them lately, they're probably not going to vote for you. Yeah,
well, it makes sense. We're speaking with Ruy Teixeira, a senior fellow at both the Century Foundation and the Center for American Progress. Even if this voting group, white working class, still votes Republican, but maybe not as much to change the House majority, how does that help Democrats?
You mean if they vote more and it accomplishes some things, but doesn't get rid of the House?
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, looking immediately in 2014, certainly, if you look at the places where the Democrats are running tight Senate races and they're trying to hold the Republicans under a 6-seat gain, I think these voters are going to be pretty key to keeping Republican margins down and therefore giving the Democrats a better chance to hold on to the Senate, which realistically is their best case scenario, right? We know they're not going to make much progress in the House. It's just not going to happen in this kind of an election. But they do have a reasonable chance of holding the line in the Senate. Now, when you get to 2016, that's when it really becomes crucial, because if you can hold down Republican margins among white non-college voters to, look at the level Obama lost them in 2008, which is 18 points. You can show that if you look at the rest of the electorate and you see how the mix of voters is going to change, Hillary Clinton can clean up, basically. It would be like a landslide election if she just managed to hold white working class support to the deficit that it had in 2008 rather than 2012, which was 18 points, and continued to get the minority vote support that Obama did. And there's a lot of different ways you can do estimations based on all kinds of different scenarios, but they all tell us that if you keep the white working class vote deficit under 20 points, you're in very good shape. If you keep it to 15 points, right, which is a pretty big margin. 15 points is still a heavy loss. It's almost impossible for the Republicans to win the presidency. It's very difficult to see how they could do it. So, not impossible, but very difficult. Mm-hmm. So that's really the key to making arguably to making the Democratic coalition really robust, able to stave off the effects of some fall in turnout, some compression in margins among their best groups, all kinds of things. And if you come in with a big enough majority and you're less vulnerable to backlash, because that's typically what fuels these backlashes against an incumbent administration for the Republicans, is they rely on these kinds of voters to get riled and upset, come out in off-year elections, and just generally change the atmosphere of the country so that it's much more difficult to get stuff through Congress. I mean, leaving aside issues of distribution of House seats and so on, but just, I mean, that's just a factor. So, the key for the Democrats, if they really want the most robust possible coalition that's able to not only win elections but govern in a progressive fashion, is at the margin getting larger shares of the white working class vote to the point where their deficits aren't so terrible. And if they do that, that combined with the other demographic changes that everybody knows about and that are now well documented and that are ongoing, it makes it very difficult for the Republicans to be competitive, which means they have to do two things: either lose continually, which they won't want to do, and it'll eventually catch up with them even in the Senate and the House, or they have to change their approach somewhat. Now, if they change their approach, they become a little bit more centrist and they start supporting at least some halfway progressive measures because they want to appeal to voters like Hispanics and unmarried women and what have you. That's good, I think, because even if that gives them a little bit better chance of beating the Democrats in, say, the presidential election, it means the country have had more of a chance of moving forward, which would be good.
Absolutely. I mean, regardless of who makes the decision, if it's about the country moving forward, I think a lot of people would be fine with that. I mean, as opposed to what we've been seeing for several years now, which is just stagnation, and the country suffers for it.
Yes, no, people are ready for something different. And if the Democrats could make that case and then deliver on it to some extent with the help of some Republicans, I think people would be totally delighted. I mean, I don't think Democrats are sitting around hoping the Republican Party is going to disappear. I think they're more hoping it'll become, in a way, a little bit better competitor for some of these groups. I think on net, that would help. I think on net, it would help the country. And I think, again, is part of what's at stake in this whole bid to try to reach more white working class voters, is it sets up this different dynamic, right, where the Republicans can't rely so much on their supermajorities among these white non-college voters and are, in a sense, forced toward the center. And now they don't feel like they're being forced toward the center. They feel they can survive and perhaps even prosper by really the most reactionary and sort of head in the sand kind of politics. Mm-hmm. I think that we'll all be well served when they finally realize that they can't do that.
Is the Obama coalition of millennials, single women, highly educated people, is that going to create a long-term move toward the left among white voters, you think?
I think so. I mean, if you look at, obviously the Democrats do much worse among white voters than among minority voters. In the 2012 election, they lost white voters by 20 points. White working class voters more than that, and white college-educated voters less than that. But if you look at how the white population is likely to evolve over time, the mix of white voters, so not only are white voters going to decline as a share of voters, and they're declining at about a half point a year, basically, but the mix of white voters is likely to change. We'll have more millennial white voters and fewer of the oldest cohorts who are the most conservative. And if you look at white millennials, they're obviously not as progressive as black or Latino millennials, but they're far more progressive, less hostile to government, less hostile to the Democratic Party, actually relatively liberal on social issues. So they just got a whole different profile than older generations of white working class voters. That should make them more susceptible to democratic and progressive arguments, and it should have an effect on the overall tendencies in the white vote. There are other changes, too. You have more white voters who are secular. You have more white voters who are unmarried. You have more white voters who are more educated. We see a continuing, the only part of, if you look at it by the white voters by education, we see that white non-college voters, more, sort of conservative, are declining pretty precipitously as a share of voters. But if you look at white college-educated voters, they're continuing to increase modestly as a share of voters over time. So that means that the mix of white voters is shifting toward the college-educated and away from the non-college-educated. That's yet another factor, liberalizing the distribution of white voters, because white college-educated voters, they vote 12 to 14 points more Democratic than white non-college-educated voters. That's a pretty big difference, and we'll see more of them in the future and less of the non-college-educated whites. So a younger, a sort of generational leanings toward the millennials, the rise of the millennials, plus the continuing rise of educational attainment among whites, is one of several factors that should make whites, at the margin, more susceptible to progressive appeals. It doesn't mean the Democrats are all of a sudden going to get a majority of the white vote, but again, it means the possibility of reducing their deficits is real. And if reduce your deficits, it makes your advantages in the rest of the electorate that much more potent.
You touched on this in the article. Baby boomers are today's conservatives. Did political analysts and the media miss the fact that most boomers were not hippies and not on the political left, and perhaps missed an opportunity to bring them in?
Well, I think what they missed is the baby boom generation was pretty big, obviously, and it spanned a lot of years. And if you look at the early baby boomers, right, from about 1946 to 1954 or so, they're pretty different than the second half of the baby boom generation, the younger half. To this day, the older baby boom members, the ones in that 46 to 54 cohorts, they're pretty liberal, actually. They are the second most liberal cohort in the electorate besides the millennials. But it's the later baby boomers who have been and actually still are, to some extent, relatively conservative. They're not as conservative as the silent generation and so on, but the really older cohorts. So baby boom generation certainly. The idea they were all a bunch of hippies was never right, and we can certainly see that in the voting behavior we see today. Parts of the generation are liberal, but there are parts of it that quite definitely are not.
Very interesting stuff. Ruy Teixeira, senior fellow at both Century Foundation and the Center for American Progress, joining us today as we talk about an article that he co-authored with John Halpin in Washington Monthly, discussing how to shape an economic message that appeals to the white working class. Ruy, we appreciate your time with us today, and we look forward to having you back on americasdemocrats.org.
Glad to be here.
Thank you very much. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going, and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Economic analyst Mike Konczal explains how the government social safety net is irreplaceable by private interests. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Great news for you lovers of Wild West, shoot-'em-up, pulp fiction tales. Rick Rudy Toot Toot Perry is making a one-man stand on the Texas-Mexico border. A political stand, that is. He's been tongue-lashing Obama for not doing enough to seal the border by dispatching a human line of armed National Guard troops to protect America from what? Children, that's what. Nearly 60,000 terrorized, impoverished, and traumatized little ones have fled their hellish existences in Central America, where rape, murder, conscription into drug cartels, and hopeless poverty is their future, trekking all the way to the USA for a chance at something better. No way, shouts Sheriff Perry. This guy routinely flaunts his Christianity for political purposes, but he seems to have forgotten that Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them." Instead, the presidential wannabe bellows for their immediate deportation, claiming they'll commit crimes, bring diseases, and burden taxpayers with welfare costs. Burden taxpayers? Perry's grandstand on the border will cost taxpayers about $20 million a month to cover the state police and 1,000 National Guard troops he has deployed to the border. It's a political stunt, cynically exploiting children trying to escape unspeakable violence and poverty. But it's not his money, so what the hell? It is, however, his morality. He's so morally stunted that he's willing to militarize a humanitarian crisis and summarily send children back to their death. But it's not their future that concerns Perry. Rather, this whole show is about his own political future, for he's playing to the fear and loathing of Tea Party extremists who will dominate the upcoming Republican presidential primaries. This is Jim Hightower saying Rick Rudy Toot Toot Perry is not just callously ambitious, he's disgusting.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Whenever Republicans have tried to replace the social safety net with private support, it has failed. Economic analyst Mike Konczal offers a history of how Republicans want only the people they like to get government benefits. And we say hello to Mike Konczal, a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, where he works on financial reform, unemployment, inequality, and a progressive vision of the economy. He recently wrote an article in the journal Democracy about the fantasy of voluntarism and private charity replacing the social safety net. Mike Konczal, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. You've written that conservatives live in a fantasy world in which the government social safety net can be replaced by voluntarism and private charity. But didn't the private sector fail when it was most needed during the recent Great Recession?
Right. So what I really wanted to do was take the recent recession and kind of put it in the context of what Republicans want to do and what conservatives in particular want to do with the federal safety net, which includes Social Security, unemployment insurance, income support, health care. And say, we have even more evidence besides the historical evidence, besides just the generally good ideas about why this doesn't work, and put that in context and put it in one place where people can really engage with it. And I think it's really struck a nerve with a lot of people who are concerned about the future of our economy.
Mm-hmm. Now, Herbert Hoover, did he not also fail to enlist the private sector in providing enough relief during the Great Depression?
Right. So what I try to do is I walk through the history, and I say, when you look at the 19th century, where there's a lot of discussion about how, we only had private charities and we only had individuals, there's actually a huge amount of government support in terms of income support, in terms of old age pensions, in terms of poorhouses. And that system did not work very well, but it was distinctly backstopped by the federal government. And what you saw in particular is that the hodgepodge system that was put in place essentially fell apart during the Great Depression, which started under Hoover's presidency. And what you see is that Herbert Hoover tried very hard to try to keep the private sector going, to try to avoid having a federal state, something like Social Security, something like unemployment insurance. And it failed. And it failed for very predictable reasons that we can see in retrospect, but that Hoover tried very hard to fight against.
And we seem to be having a strong uprising of folks trying to fight all of that nowadays, too, which just doesn't make any sense when history proves that these are all good things.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're seeing on the right, and some people have accused me of attacking a straw man. Here's how I put it, is that there is actually a distinct trend, and it's in Paul Ryan's budget, and it's in some of the other discussions, that says let's just get rid of the federal states. Let's cut taxes dramatically for the rich, and in turn cut spending on the poor and cut spending on income support, with the idea that private charity and voluntarism and all these private solutions will kind of magically appear. And there's so much good evidence, both historically and just thinking it through logically, about why that won't happen. And the second is, a lot of our health insurance, a lot of our insurance state is really set up on the idea that businesses and corporations will backstop a lot of it. You can think of, defined benefit pensions and things like employer health care, things that are really being phased out rapidly. And the question is, what will come in to replace that? And I think the right says it's okay that this is dying because the private solutions will magically appear, where this article argues that it won't. And what I argue is that liberals really need to start defending the public's role in providing these things. Without it, people will just have much more vulnerable and much more insecure lives than without that obvious solution.
Yeah, we're speaking with Mike Konczal, fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and we're discussing a recent article that he wrote in the journal Democracy. about this fantasy of voluntarism and private charity replacing the social safety net. In 1934, an economist described the four horsemen of the apocalypse as accident, illness, old age, and loss of a job. But before the New Deal was fully in effect, weren't there both state government and private enterprise responses to those issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were definitely public and federal solutions to those things as well. But what we saw is that they were patchy. They were very insecure. They were very kind of random. They didn't have the deep, solid, full security, that the blanket of security that can be provided by the federal government through things like the Social Security Act and its subsequent revisions. What you saw, though, when you're dealing with private charity in this kind of way, what you see is that a lot of private charity kind of comes and goes at the whims of people with money. And a lot of it ends up going to things that don't particularly need support. You can think of very lavish donations to very rich colleges, for instance. And crucially, it doesn't provide an anchor through the business cycle. So one thing we saw is that private donations fell, and they fell as a percentage of GDP even during the Great Recession, which if you really thought that there was this voluntaristic kind of backstop that would always provide some security for the economy, you would see it increase or at least stay the same. And we didn't see that. So we know it's also insecure. It's not there precisely when we need it, which was also the obvious lesson of the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're all aware of how FDR's New Deal set in place a vision of government coming to the rescue of the poor and sick and when all else failed. But didn't government also play a big role in making rich people richer in the 19th century? It's worthwhile to really kind of step back and say, what did FDR do? Because, I work for the Roosevelt Institute, and, people have a sense of it, but the actual idea that economic security, that protection from what you just described as the four horsemen of old age and sickness and income instability, that is actually a precondition of real, genuine freedom. That allows us to lead more fuller lives, and it allows things like volunteerism and private charity to kind of be much more nimble and try to fill in the gaps that exist in civil society. I think it's a really powerful vision. I think it's one that people are starting to realize there's a good reason we came up with it. Now, it's definitely true that the government provided a solid risk network, basically a welfare state for businesses in the 19th century, which people now really understood was a precondition of one of the reasons we became the predominant world economy during the 19th century. Things like the bankruptcy code, corporate charters, the ability to use land, things like this, the expansion westward. All these things were things that were really consciously meant to provide a risk-sharing network for businesses. And it's a logical argument that was extended to workers during the Great Depression, and now it needs to be extended to everyone. And trying to finalize that project, I think, is a real incomplete project of liberalism, and I think people are starting to realize that again. This is what I can't understand, is how, with so much historical evidence as to what works and what doesn't work, and yet you've got all these people, a la Paul Ryan and company, trying to get rid of some of these great things that we've had in place for years, rather than maybe perhaps update them or modernize them and that kind of thing. And that just doesn't seem to make sense. People don't realize how much they rely on the government.
Yeah, and there's obviously a kind of right-wing and a very libertarian fantasy about the 19th century being this kind of Yowman, farmer, the thing where the government played no role in removing Indians or, providing corporate charters for businesses or, just the Western, is a very conscious Lincoln-era Republican project to have westward expansion be a de facto welfare state. Liberals and Democrats sometimes also playing into it, too, to think that the New Deal was and the progressive movement broadly was this giant from the country where really it was a giant break in some very crucial ways. But it was also a continuation of many things that already existed. I think the right just really wants to lower taxes, and I think they want reasons to think that will magically take care of other things. Mm-hmm. I think they also kind of disrespect civil society in a way by assuming it can do things that it consciously can't. And I understand they really want to be the party of churches and communities, and liberals need to really step up and say, no, we're the real party because we respect what it does, and we don't think it can be a de facto social safety net the way that the federal government is.
And trickle down just does not work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen cutting taxes and deregulation over the past 30 or 40 years. And, you see growth is a little bit slower than it was during the mid-century period. And crucially, wages, you can quibble, but basically have not budged that much. They certainly haven't kept up with how much more productive and how much richer of a society we are. The top 1% have largely captured most of those gains. And in the future, as Thomas Piketty's book Capital argues, wealth holders are even more primed to capture that if we're going down the path that we're going.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Mike Konczal, fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and having a discussion about an article that he wrote recently in the journal Democracy. Beyond FDR, you cite Harry Truman's vision of how charity should work. In a nutshell, what was that?
Well, it's in the piece, and I highly recommend your listeners check it out. It's online at Democracy Journal, and it's available to be read without a subscription or anything. But you should also subscribe because it's a great magazine. And the idea of Truman's vision, it's just a great quote. It's like everyone gives, and then everyone contributes, and everyone benefits. It's really, the federal government using its powers as a giant risk pool. It's the ultimate kind of social insurance. And from his vision is that community then is no longer kind of vision of where the poor have to prove how good they are to the rich, or the people who have fallen on tough times have to beg or argue that they're somehow worthy of basic decency like healthcare and security in old age. And instead, it's something that's given to us as citizens, and then community can actually be a true brotherhood of solidarity among equals, really, or at least among equals enough. And I think that's a really powerful vision that turns a lot of that kind of right-wing rhetoric upside down and on its head, because it's, for them, they don't say it this way, but it's very clear they have this idea of this disciplinary mechanism and the idea that only the good people will get security, which is something that should be really genuinely disgusting to people who have an egalitarian or just anyone who really believes in some form of equality against the real harshness of this kind of post-industrial capital society we live in.
Mm-hmm. And can't the argument be made that a strong government safety net makes things better for everyone, even the well-off?
Well, as I try to point out, this recession would have been so much worse if we didn't have the system in place. I mean, you would have seen much more hunger, much more unemployment if there wasn't this base amount of income support that was able to keep people, buying things and keeping the economy turning on some gears at least.
Yeah.
It's one of the three things, along with not letting the banks fail and the Fed not going hard money, that really prevented this Great Recession from becoming a Great Depression. That's in no way to minimize how difficult this has been, but it wasn't 25 or 30% unemployment. And the fact that, within a year, the government was able to get 3 to 4% of GDP, which is roughly the amount of all charitable giving in the country, including rich schools and all that stuff. It was able to mobilize that and get that to people who needed income support, which kept them spending money, which kept the economy going. So, yeah, that alone benefited everyone in a very, material way. But also more generally, to have the federal government take care of this heavy lifting allows charities and allows civil society to really focus on the things that matter to people equally, but that's just much more targeted for that. Things like building community, building relationships, and so on and so forth.
I don't know how you feel about this, but I sort of, if we're going to get something moving in a more progressive direction, I would think that it's got to start at the top with getting the message out better. I've been tooting this horn for years now about how this administration in general has not been getting messaging out there the right way. We've seen it with health care and how that's gone. Everything should be heading in a better direction than it has been, and I think it starts at the top.
Yeah, no, President Obama has obviously walked into a Great Recession, which has been very difficult. The writer Chris Hayes once wrote that President Obama might be like the liberal equivalent of President Nixon, someone who not the paranoid megalomaniac guy, but the guy who was the guy who understood the way the conservative movement was coming,
right?
But ultimately was boxed in by Congress. Like people always say this, Nixon was a giant liberal president, but that's because Congress made him contort his vision a certain way.
Yeah.
Where Obama, is a guy who does a lot of things, but ultimately Congress has been boxed in by austerity. It's been boxed in by a broken Senate. I would have liked to see President Obama do a lot more where he had executive power to do it, like on foreclosures, like on the military-industrial complex. On the other hand, he's doing a lot of great stuff, like the very recent announcement on climate change. I think has been a very, very positive move. But ultimately, yeah, I'm cautiously hopeful. I think 2016 will be a big election where you'll see one vision that wants Democrats to move much more to the center, and then another vision that will hopefully be partisan in the debate that wants Democrats to become much more progressive and have this vision and this argumentative mode about, the government actually can do these core basic things. They can't run your life for you, but they can provide a baseline of support in a way that works for the betterment of everyone.
Let's look forward to that happening. Mike Konczal, fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and we've been discussing his recent article in the journal Democracy about the fantasy of voluntarism and private charity replacing the social safety net. Mike, as always, thank you for your time today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, retiring Senator Tom Harkin, the founder of 21st Century Democrats.
And, you hear a lot of criticism about the United States Congress. Most of it deserved, but there are a few exceptions. And we are so proud and happy to welcome to the studio this morning. I have to tell you, there is nobody in the entire United States Congress whom I admire more. Nobody who has fought harder for all the causes that you and I as progressive believe in, and nobody, I think, who has accomplished more in his time in office for the American people than the great Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa, who joins us this morning. Senator, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Bill, thanks for the invite. It's always great to be with my progressive friend here.
Now, so is it? Can we still change your mind here?
No.
Yeah. Is it too late?
No. I got a great guy following me by the name of Bruce Braley. So there you go.
All right.
Now a young progressive, so he can move ahead.
How many years in the House for you, and then how many in the Senate?
10 in the House and 30 in the Senate. 40 years, Bill. So that's been a long haul. But it's been good. And we just had a little event last night with George Miller from California.
I was there.
I know.
Great.
I saw you there with Carol, and we had a great time. And George and I came together in 1974. We were on the same committees, both in the House and then in the Senate, and so we did a lot of work together for 40 years.
Great teamwork. One of the things I know at the Roosevelt dinner recently that you talked about you're the most proud of is the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yeah.
You mentioned about your brother,
right.
how personal this is for you.
Yeah.
And so what difference has that made in the lives of Americans, do you see?
Oh, man. You go back before 1990 when it was signed into law. If you were a person with a disability, you just about were excluded from society, both physically, because of the physical barriers. I mean, every time you walk down the street and you see a curb cut,
think of that bill, right?
Think of the bill. And it's amazing. When we thought of that, we thought, well, this is for people with disabilities who use wheelchairs, blind people with walking sticks, seeing eye dogs. You do those curb cuts. But people who are out there with their babies and strollers, elderly people using those walkers, they love that too.
Yeah.
So we found through the years that if you do things to make life better for people with disabilities, it helps everybody. I tell you, here's a challenge I always issue people. If you see a place that has a ramp and stairs, just stay there a while and watch how many people use the stairs instead of the ramp. People always use the ramp. It's just easier. Especially if you're older, people always use a ramp.
Interesting. And now, in front of the Senate, there's the opportunity to put the United States on record with the Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities. I mean, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? Shouldn't it be an automatic vote?
Well, it's a no-brainer, but I guess you have the Republicans stopping it. And I'm wondering if they have any brains at all anymore. So maybe
on what grounds?
Well, I don't know. They're afraid of the United Nations or something like that. But, This is a treaty. 148 nations have signed it. And it's to raise the standard around the world for the built environment, for transportation, education, everything for people with disabilities. It's modeled after the Americans with Disabilities Act. We had to be proud to export that from America. We had a vote on it 2 years ago. We failed by 5 votes, Bill. 5.
That's when Senator Bob Dole came to the floor, made a personal plea, and his fellow Republicans just slapped him in the face, basically.
Yeah. In fact, one of his fellow Republicans from Kansas, Senator Moran, was one of our counters in getting the votes together, and he turned around and voted against it. Well, here's what I heard, Bill, that it was held at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday in December 2 years ago. It was during a lame duck session, and Ted Cruz, we've heard of him, right?
We've heard of him, right.
Heard too much of him.
Sadly.
But he got up in the caucus. Now, mind you, he was not a senator, but he'd just been elected. And he threatened the caucus. He said, anyone who votes for that UN treaty on disabilities, the Tea Party will count that as a negative vote. And then they came out 2 hours later and caved. They just caved. We've been working hard ever since. And we have some good Republicans on it. John McCain is a strong supporter. Even John Barrasso from Wyoming, a very conservative Republican. Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire. Mark Kirk from Illinois, who doesn't like the UN, but he said the statement was, he said something like, well, if this makes the UN do something good for a change, I'm for it.
Well, that's one way to approach it. Sure. Yeah.
But we can't. The Republicans are blocking us. We need, as you know, under the Constitution, we need 2/3 vote to pass a treaty. But I think we're very close, and I think we should bring it up for vote, and I'm trying to do that, maybe even before the week is out. But if not, we'll bring it up in September.
I think one of the greatest legacies that I would hope that you'd be able to leave behind you before you end your days in the United States Senate would be to see a raise in the minimum wage, because that has been a lifelong cause of yours. And here we are stuck at $7.25.
It's hard to believe. And for tipped wages, tipped workers haven't had a raise since 1991, Bill.
No.
23 years. Still down, $2.13 an hour. My bill would raise that to 70% of the minimum wage, which would be up to $7.70 an hour. It's just abysmal. And all the data shows that these tipped workers are just being nailed all the time on their work. And mainly they're women, they're people of color, they're low income. And we've been trying, and we're going to try again when we come back in September. We'll have another vote on raising the minimum wage, and I guess the Republicans will block it again. But I've made this statement. We're either going to win the minimum wage vote in September, or we're going to win it in November at the polls.
Right.
I think people understand. People get this. This is an economic issue.
Every poll that I've seen, American people support that. And I remember a senator right after the president, I think in the State of the Union a couple of years ago, said we're going to raise the minimum wage to $9. And the next morning you were on a program, and I asked you about it. You said, that's terrible because it should be higher. Well, you got him to go higher.
We got him to go higher.
But even 10.10 is not really where it ought to be, is it?
No, if we'd kept pace with the level of minimum wage in 1968, it would be around $10.96 an hour right now. So 10.10 is close.
Yeah.
Now, why did we pick 10.10? Because we wanted to get it above the poverty level and then index it for the future. So never again.
That's the key.
That's the key. Now, a lot of Republicans are saying, we'll raise the minimum wage to $9 or $9.30 or $9.50 and then index it. But then you're indexing a below poverty wage. And we can't have. That's why I've said I'll compromise on this bill in how it's implemented or tax benefits, all that, but not on the issue of 10.10, not on going below the level of poverty. No one should go to work every day and live in poverty.
Amen to that. You know, on the jobs front and the work investment in jobs front, there have been many proposals, most of them blocked by Republicans. But one of them actually got through, signed by the president last week. You were there with him in the South Court Auditorium when he signed it. In fact, the president said, hey, this was fun signing a bill. Let's do more of these.
That's right.
The Workplace Investment Act didn't get much attention. Most people don't even know about it. What does it do?
Well, this is the Workforce Investment Act. We now call it the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, so we changed the name. It hasn't been reauthorized since 2003. When I took over the committee from Senator Kennedy in 2009, I made this a major objective, so we've worked 5 years on it, and we finally got it done. This sets up your job training programs and retraining for people that lose their jobs.
So important.
It's so important because there are jobs out there. You've heard the stories, jobs, but people aren't trained for them. Mm-hmm. Well, this combines with the federal government providing about $9 billion a year, and combining with workforce committees in local jurisdictions to provide for that kind of skills upgrade and job training for people that lose their jobs. It's long overdue because what we had in the past was not meeting the needs of today and what we see for the next several years in terms of the kind of jobs that we need. A lot of it requires equipment. Are you gonna teach someone IT on equipment that's 20 years old? Of course not. Of course not. The other thing we did in the bill, in that proposal, and one that I had been working on, was to change the way young people with disabilities enter the workforce. And that's a big part of the bill. Not too many people know about it, but it will change how, right now, Bill, when a young person has an IEP, that's an individualized education program. They're in school. They have they have special education. Up till now, usually when they get out of school, they go pipelined right into a sub-minimum wage job in some sheltered workshop, and they never get out of it.
Yeah, right.
They're never tested. It's a dead end. Mm-hmm. And we found over the years that a lot of times these people with a little bit of training and skill upgrading
can do it. Right.
They can do a lot more. So in the future, young people with disabilities will go into competitive integrated employment first. And they'll have summer internships. They'll have job shadowing. They'll have work with vocational rehabilitation, rehab offices, to get them trained so that when they get out of school, they will go into what we would call a real job, mm-hmm. which they can do.
One of the other issues that you have been way out in front on, and we've talked a little bit about before, and I don't hear anybody else talking about these for-profit colleges. That are really pretty scary, some of the stuff they get away with.
My committee, I set up an investigation team about, it's been 3 years ago now, to investigate the for-profit school industry. I didn't have a case to make one or the other. I'd heard reports coming in. I said, we got to find out about this. So we set up an investigative team, and we started having hearings on it. The Republicans boycotted my hearings. They wouldn't even come to it. They wouldn't even come.
Well, they don't even be bothered by the facts, Senator.
Exactly. So we kept bringing different people in to testify and stuff. And then we issued a report last year, a report on the for-profit school industry. And the for-profit school industry came out and said, Harkin, he's just against profits and he's against the private enterprise. And all that. I said, look, here's the report. I challenge any for-profit school out there. If you find one mistake in our report, please let me know. And you know something, Bill? I've never heard from him. I've never heard from him. But I just my committee just issued a new report this morning showing how they're now ripping off our GIs. When Jim Webb was here, he was a senator from Virginia.
From Virginia.
We passed a bill called the Post-9/11 GI Educational Benefits Bill. It upped the kind of support that GIs would get in terms of education. Well, the for-profit industry has taken advantage of that. In the last, since 2010, we point out they've gotten about $1.7 billion of taxpayer money. This is taxpayer money.
Whoa.
And most of it goes to for-profit colleges that are publicly owned, and their shareholders on the stock exchange get all this money. And about 2/3 of the kids that go there drop out without any degree, and sometimes they borrowed some of their own money. And you know why? Here's something, a little fact that people don't know, Bill. We have a provision in law under this provision that says that under the benefits for schools for federal loans and federal help. It's called the 90-10 rule. Only 90% of the funds that go to a school can only come from the government.
Yeah.
10% must come from the individual. But that doesn't include military money.
Oh, yeah.
So what they're doing is they go after a GI. So for every GI they get signed up, they can go out and sign up 9 more non-GIs. It is a scam to beat all scams.
Yeah.
Now, Corinthian College is now going bankrupt. They're going under. They made $186 million in the last 2 years just from taxpayers. Now the GIs are out. They've got other debts that they've got to pay, and all the shareholders and the people that run the Corinthian, they're going to get off scot-free.
Yeah. I don't know why they should get 1 penny of public. I mean, if these are for-profit colleges, they shouldn't get a penny.
Well, they say for-profit. It's taxpayer-funded colleges is what they are. Those for-profit.
Yeah. You have exposed this scam. Now, I can't let you go without asking you, first of all, are you still going to have your steak fry?
Yeah, this year. Yeah, okay. September 14th, the biggest and the last.
The biggest and the last. Yeah, September 14th.
That's right.
Damn it, I want to go to that.
And it's right south of Des Moines. I guarantee you it will be a big one.
All right, okay. I'm going to be there.
You got to be there.
Now, how's Bruce Braley doing? Are we going to have a good progressive step up in your shoes?
Absolutely. Bruce is doing fine. This person he's running against has gotten a lot of publicity because she castrates pigs. That's what we need in the United States Senate, right? And she rides a motorcycle and shoots a pistol at a target called Obamacare. Anyway, one of those things. So she kind of got up. She's a state senator from out in a very conservative rural area of Iowa. But Bruce is doing well. It's going to be a tough race. Look, Bill, Iowa's a very close state, as you know.
Yep.
I've always had tough races. I've had close races. But I'm telling you, Bruce Braley's progressive agenda and his record here in the House of Representatives will come through in the end. I have no doubt about it. It'll be a close race. I predict 52-48 for Bruce Braley.
Right. But, even in that state, which is you can't take Iowa for granted in terms of as a Democrat or liberal, you've done well, Senator, because people know where you stand, and they know you're a fighter. They know what you believe in, and you're true to you've always been true to your principles. And I can't thank you enough for all that you've done for all of us across the country.
Well, you're nice to say. I've often said that Iowa's a pretty conservative state. And you know what they want to conserve most of all? Are the liberal traditions that the progressives have brought to our country.
Oh, God love it. Okay. Thanks, Senator Harkin. Great to see you.
Bill,
thank you so much for gracing us with your time this morning.
Thank you for what you do in getting the progressive word out across America. It's just wonderful. Keep up your great work.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Ruy Teixeira, Mike Konczal, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.